This is Passport to Everywhere.
Did you know that there's a scientific reason behind why some travel experiences are better than others? It turns out our psychology, behavior, and decision making patterns all influence how we feel before, during, and after our travels. I'm excited to have Professor Jeff Galak with me today to explore the science behind designing a trip that will deliver the highest satisfaction.
I have traveled alone before, and that's been fun, but boy, is it not as fun as when I go with people that I like and then meet new people that I then wind up liking. Social connection is the thing that makes us human. So if you can marry that with your travels, I think that's a win.
Welcome to Passport to Everywhere with Indigare's Melissa Biggs Bradley. Melissa is the founder and CEO of Indigare, a travel and media company committed to inspiring and empowering people to change their lives and the world through travel, while having a positive impact on the places they visit. On the show, Melissa will reveal a behind-the-scenes look at some of the world's most treasured places, transport you to dream destinations and hotels, and introduce you to some of the most extraordinary people she's met on the road. This is Passport to Everywhere.
Jeff Galak is an associate professor of marketing at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business and of Social and Decision Sciences at CMU's Dietrich College of Humanities. He received his Bachelors of Science in Marketing and Economic Theory, his Master's of Philosophy in Marketing, and his Ph.D. in Marketing from New York University. He's an expert in consumer behavior, consumer psychology, judgment and decision-making, and research methodology, and his academic research has been published in many top journals. I discovered Jeff's work in a Wall Street Journal article called How to Have a Great Vacation: What Science Tells Us. And after reading it, I decided I had to find a way to get him on the show. I'm thrilled I was successful. Today, we'll explore the science of enjoying travel and how small choices can impact your overall satisfaction. Stick around because the findings might surprise you. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I'd love to start, Jeff, with getting a little bit of background on who you are, what you teach, how you became interested in this. So, you've been at Carnegie Mellon for over 10 years. What made you decide to study marketing and economic theory?
So we'll have to go back further than 10 years. I didn't want to study marketing and consumer psychology. I had no interest in it. I was going to be a finance geek. So as an undergraduate, I went to the NYU Stern School of Business, and I wanted to be an investment banker. And I'll be honest with you, I had no idea what an investment banker was. I just knew they made a lot of money. So I went to the business school as an undergrad. I had a great internship. I worked in finance for a little bit, and I realized I really did not enjoy the work. And so then I went to a mentor that I had as an undergrad. He was one of my professors, Professor Jack Jacoby. And I confided in him. I said, look, I really don't like this career. I don't enjoy the work. I think it's not for me. And he kind of half jokingly said, he was a marketing professor. He said, hey, why don't you go get a PhD in marketing? And we had a very thoughtful conversation. He explained to me what it was about, what people study in this space. And I did my own research after that and thought this is actually pretty appealing. And then I went ahead and decided that was the right path for me. So I applied to a bunch of programs. I was accepted again at NYU Stern School of Business. I had left at that point, but then I went back, and it's a phenomenal doctoral program for marketing. And I kind of fell in love with it. I had a great academic advisor who guided me on really wonderful paths of studying consumer psychology and how people behave, why they make the choices they make, what makes people happy, what makes them less happy. And it kind of went from there.
Bravo to you for recognizing that if you didn't love what you were doing, you should change your path.
Thank you.
Um,
I had the privilege of being able to do that. Not everybody has that, and I was very fortunate. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about consumer behavior, and I think some people have some sense about marketing, but can you talk a little bit about the overlap of consumer behavior and economics and how you even study that?
Yeah. So this could be a very long answer. I'll try to keep it a little shorter. Historically, economics believed in what's called a rational agent model. So if somebody makes a choice, they're doing that with full information, thinking completely about everything that's going to happen from now until forever from now. And they integrate all that information and then they magically compute something and they maximize their utility. So it's a bit of a simplistic, admittedly, take on kind of classical economic theory. And then since like the 70s or so, maybe the late 70s, early 80s, there's a movement to do behavioral economics, which is to say, rather than just take that as fact, let's actually observe what humans do and then try to understand how they're actually coming to those choices, how they're actually realizing the decisions that they're making. In parallel, in fact, preceding that, you had psychology, which was already doing that, right? So if we want to describe economics, traditional economics, as prescriptive, it's kind of like what people should do. Psychology and then later behavioral economics is descriptive. It's just saying, let's observe and see what, and try to explain what we observe, but let's just observe and take that at face value. So the intersection really is social psychology and cognitive psychology. And I'm much more of a social psychologist. That's my training. It precedes behavioral economics, but it also informs behavioral economics. And now I think we're finally at the point where behavioral economics is also starting to inform a little bit about what's happening in the psychology space. They're related fields at this point, but that took us a good 50 years of research until we really started to converge the two.
I'd love to have you give listeners an example of that, the comparison that really demonstrates where consumer behavior is at work that is not necessarily a straight rational
Oh,
decision.
sure. Okay, so let me think of a good example for you. So a classic one is inconsistency in intertemporal choices, right? So it shouldn't really matter if I'm making a choice for today or for tomorrow. My preferences should be consistent, but people are not, right? When they think about the future, they what we call hyper discount, right? Like they assume that time is going to pass very slowly when it actually passes very quickly, and they make bad trade-offs for like, should I do something now? I mean, like the classic one is like, should I eat the salad or should I eat the cheeseburger? That's a trade-off because the cheeseburger's tastier. I'm sorry for the salad lovers out there, right? Like it's a better meal for if you eat meat, if you have a veggie burger, but it's going to hurt your health, right? So that's an intertemporal trade-off, right? Like how do I make that choice? It's very hard to do that, but most people will not take the time to think through the long-term consequences, even though they should, right? In a perfectly rational world, we'd say, what is this going to do to my weight? What is it going to do to my cholesterol? What is it going to do to my blood pressure? And all, but we don't do that, right? Like, let's not kid ourselves. We say we want the tasty burger, we eat the tasty burger.
From watching consumer behavior, we've learned that actually they're more likely to make that healthy choice earlier in the morning than late in the day for all sorts of reasons.
There can be all sorts of time of day effects as well, right? There's also circadian rhythm effects. People are morning people or evening people, and they make different choices in those different contexts as well. Yeah.
I'd love to get into how you came to travel and some of the research that you've done in terms of looking at the decisions people make and how they experience things.
So those are going to be two separate answers, right? So for the second one, I, for a long time, have been studying how people maintain happiness. So, especially with consumption, right? So, when you're consuming, it doesn't have to be an experience like travel. It could be eating candies or socializing with friends. It could be anything. But how do you maintain that over time? Because one of the inalienable truths about humanity is that even things that we enjoy at a peak don't stay there forever, right? I don't think that's a controversial statement, right? You might love something today, but if you overconsume it, the enjoyment tends to go down. So that's something I've been studying for nearly 20 years at this point. And I'm happy to dig into all of that. But to answer the first question about travel, honestly, I had just come off of a trip that I was not super happy with. I was with my family, and we could talk about that as well. And I started thinking about like, why was I not like, why was this not a great experience? We took our family to Costa Rica, which is pretty. I have two young children. That's a big trip to do with young children. And Costa Rica is lovely, nothing against Costa Rica, but the trip itself was not ideal. And so I started thinking about what it was that made me unhappy. And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of saying, okay, can I connect what I know about people's happiness in general and what I had experienced? It wasn't an apples to apple comparison to write an article, right? Because an article has to have a structure and it has to have a point. But that's where that came from.
Let's dive in actually right now to the article and the broader what you've learned about maintaining happiness through consumption. For those who may not have read the article, will you talk about some of the points in it? And it was called How to Have a Great Vacation, What Science Tells Us, which I really love because we think that we know what we want. And as you said, happiness doesn't maintain, but there are certain things we can learn about delivering happiness and changing habits. So let's dive into some of the examples. So for instance, you gave the example of doing less can actually lead to a more enjoyable time. So if you could explain how that works.
Sure. It's a little counterintuitive at first, but I think once you unpack it, it starts to make sense. So pick your favorite activity on vacation. And I think in the article I talked about going to the beach, which ironically is not my favorite thing to do. I'm not a beach person, but many people are. And so I feel like it was a good example. But pick whatever it is that you enjoy doing, right? I like hiking. I like being a little more adventurous. If that's all I did, right, as my favorite activity, it wouldn't be a crazy thought to say, hey, if you're planning a trip, plan to do the things you love to do. That seems very intuitive. But then you start to realize, well, hiking the first day is really fun, right? Your nature, for me at least, your nature, it's beautiful. You're maybe with friends, with family, and maybe even the second day is great. But by the third day, I like my air conditioning too. Like it would be nice to do something different. And so if all I did was plan one type of activity, even if it's my favorite activity for the duration of a trip, that might be counterproductive, right? It might be the case that in foresight that seems wonderful, but in reality, when I get there, I'm kind of hoping to change it up a little bit more. So doing less of the specific activity that makes you happiest, it seems weird because why would you do less of the thing that you love? But in the grand scheme of the entire trip that you're taking, that can be a very powerful tool to say, let's add some other things in there. Let's plan for different types of experiences, not just that one thing that you love. No, 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 I'm not suggesting you should do things that you hate, right? I'm just suggesting there must be other things that would also bring you joy to break up some of that monotony.
Yeah. And one thing that really resonated with me there was having traveled with kids and wanting them to experience culture and fall in love with going to museums. It was one of the things that I learned early on with kids is like, yes, you can have a museum in your itinerary, but let's spend no more than an hour and pick 2 or 3 things for them to look at. And it's much more likely that they're going to actually like that experience than if you spend most of the day dragging them around. I mean, does that work in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, kids are a bit of a different animal. They have slightly different psychology than adults do. But yes, your intuition is spot on. And I would say, related to this, is ending on a high note before you hit that doldrum, before you hit the tedium, is really important because it's going to come, right? Like the kids is a great example. It's just going to come faster for them, I think, than for adults. But it'll come for adults as well. So if you could end on that high note, what that's also going to do is it's going to encourage you to do it again next time. If I remember the boredom that came from hiking for the seventh day in a row, I'm not going to plan another hiking trip. Even though those first 2 days were just pure bliss, right? I was delighted to have those. I'm not going to want to do it. With the kids, it's even worse, right? If you end that museum trip with them kicking and screaming, and then you say, hey, we're going to another museum tomorrow, they're not going to be in a good mood for you, right? But if you go, you see whatever it is you see, cultural experience, and end it quickly, then it's still fun for them to see it the next day too. So you're really kind of getting this repeat experience that's still positive.
It's that old adage of leave the party when you're still having fun. So you talk in the article as well about hedonic consumption,
Yeah.
if that's the correct way to say it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how enjoyment naturally declines over time. So to me, this is related, but understanding that, what are some of the learnings that you would say that travelers can take in both the planning stage and while on vacation?
Yeah, so certainly while on vacation, and planning is in there as well, but putting in breaks is just it's such a small little thing, right? Just little deviations. And I actually in the article I had an example that I think I actually got a fair bit of pushback on, and I take it, which was I said like, look, if you enjoy going to a nightclub and you go dancing, even that gets tiring. So I said, and I admittedly was trying to be a little cheeky here. I said, bring a book and take a break and read for a few minutes, which I understand in a nightclub is not the thing you might do, but the spirit is there, right? It take a moment to do something different, right? So the beach example, we can come back to that. I think I said, go inside and check your email, which I think a lot of advice will be told, like a lot of advice columns are going to tell you, don't do your work, don't do it. No, it's fine. Just take a break. It doesn't have to be all consuming, but go inside the lobby, enjoy the air conditioning, get a drink, check your email, and then go back to the beach, right? Just breaking things up is going to be a big benefit. And in planning, it's the same thing. If you could plan more variety in what you're going to do, that's going to help, right? Rather than planning nonstop beach followed by nonstop, I don't know, touring around the countryside, try to do alternating days or half days of each activity. And that's going to really reduce some of this hedonic decline.
I mean, again, that goes back to that old adage of variety is the spice of life, but in some ways, you got the science behind it. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about like how is it that we experience happiness over time and how it declines? What is the research shown you about that?
So the how or the why, because those are a little bit different.
Let's do both.
So the how is pretty mechanical, right? So I'm just trying to think how low level to go, meaning like into the brain or not, but we'll skip that for now. Every experience you have is going to generate a response from you. So either a stimulus, whatever it is going to generate a response. That could be a bright light shining in your eyes and it causes pupil dilation, or it could be a delicious chocolate treat that you put in your mouth and you salivate and all the things that happen when you're eating something tasty. And it is just a part of our physiology and neurology that with the more activation we have, over time, the lower the intensity of the responses. So again, this is true for pain, this is true for anxiety, this is true for happiness, right? It's true for all these things, right? Like if you think about the flip side of it, what do you tell somebody when they have a bad breakup? You say, look, time heals all wounds, right? It's true, right? Because it's horrible in the moment, but with time, things do get better. It's the exact same thing on the positive side. Somebody gets married, it's a wonderful, joyous experience. I'm married happily now for 14 years, but I'm sure that the day of my wedding was peak happiness, right? And it's not that it's dropped precipitously, but we all understand the reality of life, right? That it does, it's not the same as that one day. So that's the how. The why is a little trickier. And so this is actually where a lot of my research comes in. I'm not the first person to make this observation by any stretch of the imagination. What I've done is I've called out that the reason that this happens is much more in the mind than it is in the body. So up until what I and my colleagues have done, the standard belief, for example, for food was that the reason you like the last bite of pizza less than the first bite of pizza is a physiological response. So it could be that the glucose levels in your blood have changed. It could be stomach distension affects things. So your stomach literally stretches as you eat and that feeds up into your brain. So we call that a bottom up response. And what we demonstrated is that actually that is almost exclusively not true. It's a top down response. It's the perception of consumption that is driving this reduction in enjoyment.
Well, what's interesting about that to me is, in a way, when you were first explaining the outcome and that it had to do with the top down, my guess would have been that anticipation of something adds to enjoyment, and once it's sated, there's a less of a heightened perception of the experience. But in some ways, what you're talking about is more that there's in addition or instead of, there's a value judgment that we put on an
Yeah,
experience.
could be part of it as well. Yes. Yeah, and so even with food, and I know we want to talk about travel, we can come back to that. But with food, we have very specific references that we refer to. Like, think about every food you eat has a serving size. There's a recommended serving size. I admittedly don't know exactly how those are defined by the companies that put them out there, but boy, are they in your face, right? Like if something says to you 5 cookies is the serving size and you just ate 10 cookies, you feel like you just overate, even though objectively speaking, that may or may not be true. And so, yeah, having that norm around in society, wherever it happens to come from, massively affects our enjoyment of everything we experience.
And actually, as someone who cares about having people have amazing travel experiences, it's not just the anticipation factor that I think really does add to people's enjoyment, but the context around why someone is traveling or their feelings around the places they're going.
I think that's right. Anticipation is really interesting in a couple of ways, right? So, two different and I think opposite direction findings. One is there's some research, this is not my own, that imagined consumption acts very similarly to actual consumption. So, simply imagining eating a bunch of food or experiencing a bunch of things has similar satiating properties as actual consumption. It's not as intense as you can imagine, but it has similar effects. So, in anticipation, if you're imagining going on that scuba trip, and all you're thinking about is diving and being with the fish and being with coral and doing this amazing experience, whatever it might be, that actually might pre-satiate you to the point where when you get there, it's not as enjoyable. It's not a big effect, but it can go the other way too. So we can think about utility. Utility is a big term in economics, right? It's like how much value are you getting for something? And again, the traditional view of utility was consumption utility, doing the thing. But I think as you appreciate and you just mentioned, and I certainly feel this way, there's something else. There's something called anticipatory utility. It's the utility of ruminating on this amazing experience that you're about to have. I am guilty of this. Like I plan trips for a year in advance because I love thinking about for a year. It's like I get to experience this trip not just for a week, but for the whole year that's coming up. Not everybody feels that way, right? For some people, it's anxiety inducing, but there are those who, like myself, just really enjoy that. And then when I get there, well, then we see what happens because then reality kicks in, right? In my imagination, it's always perfect. Reality is not always quite so great. Yeah.
Then I would be curious whether you have thoughts around what happened to many people during COVID, which was when they couldn't travel. What they did was think about past travels or future travels. But let's focus on the past travel, because if you have a great experience, then does that also provide a future utility because of the memories and the looking
It,
back?
it does. Yeah. So, in fact, another body of research that's not really in the article, but I study sentimental value. And so, souvenirs are a classic example of that. Why? Because they remind you of that wonderful experience that you had wherever it is that you were traveling to. So, yes, there is utility in that. Now, COVID, I think, is a weird example because I think I could easily imagine somebody remembering an amazing experience, being joyous from that, but then being very depressed by the fact that they cannot go and experience it now because there's all these travel restrictions, right? So I don't really know how that would play out in net, but you're 100% correct that the memory of an experience could be amazingly powerful. So again, we come back to utility. There's consumption utility. We talked about anticipatory utility, but there's also remembered utility, which is quite arguably the largest component out of all of it because it lasts for so much longer. Right. So if you think about a trip, maybe you plan it 6 months out. So you have 6 months of anticipation, a week or two of travel, and then a lifetime of remembering it. And to whatever extent that is a positive memory, it could be very powerful on your overall well-being.
Absolutely. I mean, there's many people who will look back through their life and have those travel moments that are the ones that stand out in an entire lifetime. So,
A tradition that my wife and I have is whenever we do a substantial trip, I don't mean visiting the relatives, I mean something substantial, is we'll always print out a physical photo book of that trip. Nothing fancy, but just enough to remind us of the key moments. And every few months, we'll go over to our bookshelf that has all these, and then we'll look, and we're like ear to ear smiling the entire time that we're looking at these things. And so, even though the trips have long since passed, they're still bringing us tons of value.
You're listening to Passport to Everywhere, and I'm your host, Melissa Biggs Bradley. Today I'm speaking with Professor Jeff Galak about what his research tells us about the science of creating travel memories. A few of his tips are particularly gratifying for me to hear, as I founded Indagare to help people have better travel experiences. And thanks to Jeff's research, I now better understand the science behind what makes our travel designer's curation and our site's new trip planning tool so special to use.
so going back to the article, you talked about the concept of choice overload, which I also think is really interesting because we spend a lot of time helping people plan trips, and I found this fascinating.
So the basic idea of choice overload is that in prospect of making a choice, more options should be good, right? Again, thinking about classic economics, right? The more choices you have, of course, it's better because you have more ability to match your own idiosyncratic preferences to whatever the options are in the universe of whatever you're doing. The problem is it also induces anxiety, right? So it's difficult to make a choice when you're choosing from 600 options in front of you. Much easier if it's choosing from 5 or 6, just to be very extreme in those. So that's already difficult, and it makes the choice itself stressful for a lot of people. And then you have the post-choice regret, which is really the problem. So and I think in the article I talk about hotel choices. Pick your favorite destination. There's 100 hotels to choose from, right, in your price point. There's many. And some are better than others in some dimensions, and it's not clear in prospect from the TripAdvisor website whether this is the best one or not. You're kind of just making your best guess, right? And then you go there and you realize the experience. You have the hotel stay, and maybe it's great, and maybe it's not. But whatever it is, you're comparing it to the foregone options, the other things that you chose not to pick. If the set of things that you're comparing to is huge, the likelihood that you're going to compare to something that's better than what you have is higher. That's a high likelihood than if you just had a few options to compare to. So when we're picking something, it's very tempting. And I admitted this in the article, and I admit it here too. I do this, and I don't follow the research because it's hard. This is my own personal psychology, right? This is like a do as I say, not as I do type situation. I love researching travel. I find that experience enjoyable. It's just fun for me to do. And so I'll look at every single hotel. I'll look at every tour operator. I'll look at every single cruise line. I'll do every single because I enjoy it. But then when I get on the trip, I have so many things to compare to. And it's always like, well, this room's nice, but that room would have been nicer in that picture I remember from that other hotel. And it's doing myself a disservice. If I just found a decent hotel that was in my price point in a reasonable location and just booked it and didn't look at anything else, the research tells me I would be better off. because I just wouldn't have that counterfactual, that comparison to make.
It's fascinating because in some ways we have a client base, a lot of whom come to us because we've curated down the options for them. On the other hand, we have a lot of people in the same community who love to travel research just like you do. What's the sweet spot of feeling like you get the value of all the anticipatory research and the fun of it, and yet you don't have that sort of FOMO effect of having so much information that you can't just enjoy what you've chosen.
So it's interesting, and for your listeners, I don't work for you. We're not affiliated. You're not paying me for this, but I actually love curated services like this, right? I really do. So I've used travel agents before in the past in some capacity. And my favorite one was this was years and years ago in Croatia, and this was like, let's say 15 years ago. So the internet was there, but it probably wasn't quite as robust as it is today to figure things out. So my wife and I said, let's get a travel agent. We'll figure this out. What I would have really not enjoyed is if that travel agent had come back to me and said, here's your hotel, here's your next hotel, here's your next hotel. But instead they said, here's 10 options or 5 options or whatever it was in each of the cities that we wanted to stay at that are curated to our preferences, to our price point. And then we just picked. And that was really great because it still gave us some sense of autonomy that we're making that choice, but it didn't have me researching forever. Like we personally enjoy staying in smaller bed and breakfast type places. I mean, man, trying to find that in a foreign country with foreign language issues, I'd be spending weeks researching that. But here's somebody who knew what they were doing that was able to really guide that. So I love the curated experience when you still give me a little bit of choice and a little bit of that joy I get from planning, but you take the bad options off the table.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And you talked about the satisficer and the maximizer. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so this is a kind of classic distinction in psychology. The maximizer, think of the person who goes to a restaurant and looks at the menu and looks at every single item on that menu and then thoughtfully deliberates and makes a choice. The satisficer scans the menu, whatever, how they do it from the top to the bottom. And the moment they reach a choice that they're satisfied with, the satisficer, that's good enough, they just say that one. And then they stop researching the rest of the way. So the maximizer has more information. They can presumably make a better informed choice because they can see all the options in front of them. But the satisfizer on average is happier because they don't have those counterfactuals, because they haven't taken the time to read every single option in front of them. This is true for restaurants, this is true for travel. Right? You could imagine you order the duck at the restaurant and then you see that it's not quite what you wanted. And then you sit there and you're just thinking, oh, man, I really should have gotten steak. Right. But if you didn't know that the steak was even an option on that menu because you just picked the thing right away, then it just is what it is, and you're fine and you're content and you move on with your life. Yeah.
It's funny, I don't know what exactly I am because I'm a satisficer unless I'm in a group and someone orders something that I think I might want, and then I immediately change to whatever it was that they
Yeah,
got.
that's common.
Know myself well enough to know I don't wanna
That is
miss.
very typical. And it was like, I think in psychology, we have this tendency to be absolutist, like you're a satisficer or you're a maximizer. The truth is, it's context dependent. People are going to act differently in different settings. It's time different. So, right, as you age, things might change. But in a moment, you could act as if you're a maximizer more so, or than you are a satisficer. And on average, across all those things, satisficers tend to be happier in life.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So another thing that I loved about the article and your research, and I want to get into, is the idea of the less enjoyable experiences on a vacation. And I'd love to hear you explain the psychology of that because I again have seen this demonstrated frequently on trips.
Yeah, so by our very nature, we are creatures of comparison. We don't have, in most cases, a way to judge things in their absolute sense. And so if you have an experience, to know whether it was good or bad, I mean, there's some base level, like it's enjoyable or not enjoyable, but how enjoyable or how unenjoyable, you need something to compare it against. This is true for everything we do. So, I mean, there's the classic studies in economics, in fact, look at satisfaction with salaries. Right? Like, would you rather have the highest salary but in a low tier company, or the lowest salary in a high tier company, even though that lower salary might be higher than the other one? And the answer is most people actually would rather be the most compensated in a lower compensated overall role because they just don't want to feel like they're the loser at the bottom of the totem pole. So, and that's weird because you should, of course, always want the higher salary overall. And that's true for everything, right? You look at your house, is your house satisfactory? Well, it is after you go to a lower income neighborhood, but it looks terrible compared to the mansions in the higher end neighborhood. It's all comparisons. And so on a trip, that's true as well, right? The beach is wonderful. We'll come back to that one. But compared to what? Right? Is it compared to, I don't know, for me, hiking? Like, no, the beach would be terrible compared to hiking. I would much rather be hiking. And so having that counterfactual is useful. And what I suggest in the article is forcibly introducing something that's a little bit worse than you maybe would normally pick to do. First of all, there's something fun about discovery and doing something different. Like that's a side point. But what that also does is it acts as a reference to make all the positive experiences feel all that much better. So I talk about hotels. If you're the kind of person that likes to stay in a fancy hotel, there's nothing wrong with that. But maybe choose something a little bit down market the next time you travel, because by comparison, everything else will feel so much better and so much more enjoyable. I think about it in my own experience. This was maybe 10 years ago or so. I was on a trip to Croatia with my wife. And I, long ago before that, had a motorcycle license and knew how to ride a motorcycle, but it had been like a decade since I rode a motorcycle. I was not very comfortable on it. But there was an experience where we could rent a motorcycle and ride around one of the islands in Croatia. And I was incredibly apprehensive about it because it's something I haven't done in a long time. It felt a little dangerous. And we did it anyway. And it was, admittedly, I was high anxiety the entire time we were doing it. But not only did we discover some really interesting spaces that we probably wouldn't have otherwise, but man, did I feel so wonderful when we got back to our rental car and we're driving in this company. Normally driving the rental car is a chore. But here I was like, oh, thank goodness. Like I'm back on four wheels and everything feels great. And so it just made that even mundane experience feel wonderful in comparison to this other stress-inducing experience that maybe you wouldn't actively pursue.
And it's funny, you touch on 2 things there that I have found as a journalist on travel for 20 some years. One of the keys is being aware of the progression. I often talk about it as a meal when you plan a trip. There's something less comfortable, you gotta put it at the beginning so you can build, because to your point about comparison, that's human, and we are much more willing to go from discomfort to comfort, or low to high than high to low. And so the progression of which I think you put things in throughout your trip, and it goes back to your point too. It's like also the memory. I just was chimp trekking in Tanzania where we went to go and see the chimpanzees, and we stayed in the best place in the world to see chimpanzees, but you're in thatched huts in the jungle. It's for adventurous people. The end of the trip, we had a beautiful safari lodge, and we could not have done the reverse.
Oh
So
yeah, I'm sure you enjoyed the luxury and the lodge. I mean, I feel like I resonate with that 100%. Yeah.
the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is really interesting in terms of, and I think it's discomfort in some ways, but it's the novelty factor. I've always believed that you should be doing something that puts you out of your comfort zone that's new when you're traveling. To me, that's part of why I feel so much more alive and awake to the world when I'm traveling. And I think that I've watched it with other people, and it can be as simple as riding a different type of transport in a city. But I think that's important. And I'd love to hear the psychology of why you would say that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things there. I think it makes sense some of the time, right? I don't think it's a universal. And I say that because again, despite myself not being a beach person, I do get it, right? Like people lead stressful, busy lives, and sometimes doing nothing for a couple of days on a beach is exactly what people need and should get if that's what they want to have, right? That's not my preference, but I very much respect that. So I think so there are times where just doing the plain vanilla basic thing makes sense. But to your point about new experiences, um, I don't know that the psychology work that I've done necessarily speaks to how that can be beneficial. So I'm with you. Like I think you and I align personally on travel quite a bit on this one. If I had to say why I think that you're right, it's because I think part of the beauty of life is doing different things and experiencing different things. And if all you do is sit in your one little lane, that gets really tedious after a while too. So pushing yourself out of that is in fact a form of avoiding some of this hedonic adaptation and satiation that we talked about. But there's just less research on that specific thing. So I don't feel comfortable saying this is definitely true, psychologically speaking.
I'd love to hear some common mistakes that people make when planning trips. You talked a little bit about even looking at too many options being an example, but other things that you think people sometimes set themselves up for disappointment in the way they approach planning a trip.
I think setting appropriate expectations on what a trip is really important. So again, if we come back to the psychology of happiness, how something compares to what you expect to have happen is really important. So things can exceed our expectations, they can be below our expectations. I'm a parent of two younger children. I have many friends in the same boat. Some of them plan these unbelievably elaborate trips with their 2-year-olds. And I think wonderful that they're trying. That's great. But if they set their expectations a little bit more realistically, I think they would have a better experience, because they always come back flabbergasted and they didn't have a great time. And you say, yeah, you have a 2-year-old trying to go to a foreign country where it's a little bit uncomfortable and maybe you're not a seasoned traveler. And so that's hard. Not impossible. And kudos to the people that can pull that off. That's great. I know I can't. So when we travel with our family, we make sure that the trips that we choose, we know what we're getting, right? We know that we're not going to be hitting every one of my personal high points and every one of my wife's high points, because we have 2 young children that we also need to accommodate. So setting appropriate expectations for what a trip is going to be is going to set you up for an enjoyable experience. I think that's a reasonable piece of advice.
Yeah. And again, as somebody who's been a student of people planning trips for more than 20 years now and having done it myself, the other thing that I would say is your 2-year-old isn't going to remember Angkor Wat. Someone told me years ago that the rule of thumb should be you go only as many hours on a plane roughly as your kid is old. And so by the time they're 7, sure, take them to Europe. They can probably get something out of it. But I
I
also
haven't heard that. I love that. I'm going to steal that. Thank you. That's great. Yeah.
I mean, and it makes I mean, don't
Yeah.
take your kid to Hawaii in an
Yeah.
8-hour flight and a major time zone and when they've got a sleep schedule.
Hawaii is a good example for us. Like, my wife and I love Hawaii. We've been there a few times before our kids were born. But for us in Pittsburgh, it's 3 flights, right? It's like a 15-hour travel day. And as much as our daughter, who's 10 now, would love to go, no, like, I'm sorry, that's going to be a miserable experience going and coming. And as much as Hawaii is amazing, we have to wait a little bit. Yeah.
And that actually goes back to the idea of the remembrance utility value too. If you're going to make a big investment on a trip, make it for a family when they're going to remember it for the rest of their lives. Some other tips that you would give to travelers who want to apply your research to their next vacation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered some of the bases already, but the biggest one in my mind is this idea of like doing less. So just to come back to that one, in your planning process, think about what your favorite things are to do. That's great, and plan those. That you should do that. That's part of a vacation. But make sure you're not being too single-minded about it. Don't just pick the one thing. Pick as many different options as it would fit the bucket of things that you would enjoy. There's so much information out there in the world right now about different things you could do in different destinations. Adding some things that you maybe wouldn't have thought of initially is a really good thing to do. I mean, as one example that just popped into my head, I was again with my wife in the south of Spain, and we were doing a lot of cultural activities, which were wonderful. And there was a little bit of beach time as well, which was fine enough. Not my cup of tea, but it was fine. But then I looked at TripAdvisor and I saw that the number one rated activity in this region we were at was an ATV off-roading tour of the backcountry of the south of Spain, which I've never been on an ATV. My wife has never been on an ATV. That's not the kind of people we are usually. But I said, you know what? It's got to be the number one thing for a reason. And so we said, let's just do it. It's going to break up the day. It was, to this day, the best thing that we did this entire trip. And so just, again, thinking a little outside of the box of, okay, here's what you're supposed to do in this location. There's some other stuff that you can do too. Like, maybe it's worth exploring that as well.
And I wonder with your research, because I completely agree with that. And I often say to people, like, you got to build in time to be spontaneous. And I recently was in Cairo, which I've been to many times, and I had a dinner reservation, but I walked into a store and I met this woman. And she said, you should actually come to this art opening. It's a new pop-up restaurant celebrating the end of Ramadan. And I was like, okay, what the hell? I'll change my plans. And it again turned out to be my favorite meal in 2 weeks because, and I wonder if something about the spontaneity adds to the satisfaction.
It does, right? So when something is planned, you have an expectation, right? So, and again, it does come back to this quite a bit. And then it's either met or it's not. Those are the two outcomes, right? It's going to meet your expectations and exceed them, or it's not going to. When something is unplanned, there is no expectation. You're starting at zero. And so it's almost impossible for it not to be a positive experience. I actually have a whole other line of research that I do on the psychology of gift giving. And one of the things that we find, and this is related to your comment, is that the best gift you can give is the gift that's given on a random Tuesday, is what I like to call it. Right? So if it's your birthday and I give you a gift, you're expecting something. So my gift could fall flat or not. If it's a random Tuesday and I give you one rose for $1 that I got off the vendor on the street, that's going to brighten your whole day, right? That's a win because you had no such expectation, and it's very effective. So I think for travel, it's exactly the same thing. If you don't have an expectation and you do something different, it's going to be good.
In our team, we call that surprise and delight. And what I love is you can give that gift to yourself, I think, by being open to opportunities.
I agree. And I think in the article somewhere I mentioned this idea of just kind of wandering through a city. It's one of my favorite things to do. It's just like put my phone away, pick a general direction, and just start wandering. And as long as you're in a safe space, which many places are, I mean, you find things you never would have expected. There's little stores you can see, there's people, there's how they live, there's food experiences. And I think that's great for all the reasons that we've talked about here.
So, going back to the idea of the remembrance utility, are there ways that you think to strategies that can help people create more of these positive memories while on vacation?
Yeah, so we mentioned souvenirs earlier. I actually think they're incredibly powerful. And they're often thought of as like little tchotchkes that you kind of stick in the corner somewhere, but be more thoughtful about it. A souvenir that's actually prominently displayed somewhere in your home that has some connection to a positive experience you had is a very big utility booster as you walk past it, right? Most of the things we ignore, but occasionally it catches the corner of your eye when you're walking through your living room, wherever it might be. And it brings you right back to that place you were. So when you're on that trip, a lot of people will save the souvenir shopping for the airport. Oh, I got to get my souvenir for the people that are no, like be more thoughtful about it. You did this amazing thing. Is there something that can commemorate it? And it doesn't have to be something you buy, right? A pebble from a beach is just as useful and just at doing this as is buying the little logo of the beach that you were at, whatever it might be. So being very thoughtful about having physical objects to commemorate the experience. And those can be a photograph that's printed and framed and hung, that's great too, but something really thoughtful to connect you to that.
I love this because, as you might imagine, I'm a huge souvenir collector and booster, and so I like knowing that there is a true utility beyond, like, the beauty in the moment, but
The sentimental value that is provided by these objects by connecting you to those experiences, as far as what I've done in research, I think what others have as well, is it is the greatest amount of value and utility that you can have, sentimental value in particular, compared to anything else. So, like, one of my favorite examples of this is people run these studies, I've run these studies where you say to somebody, okay, imagine that your home is burning down and all the people are safe, all the animals are safe. Like, we're not going to worry about any of that stuff. And you say, tell me the three things that you're going to save from that house, and like ignore weight constraints and physical constraints. If you want to save your refrigerator, you could save your refrigerator. Nobody says like the expensive sofa that I bought, right? Everybody says the photos that I can't reproduce that remind me of the things, the mementos that I got on this important trip, the heirlooms that were passed down to me from previous generations, because those are all sentimental connections to something that's important to that person. They are the most valuable possessions that we have, bar none. And so if you appreciate that, you can actually build those, or you can say, if I'm going to be on this trip, I know this is going to be important to me. So let me be thoughtful about this purchase instead of just picking the random thing at the souvenir stop that you happen to be at.
I love that. So, sometimes trips go bad. Is there some advice from your research that you can give to travelers in a way to bounce back when the trip doesn't go as planned? I mean, other than trying to not have such high expectations going in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? It's hard because when things go a little bit bad, it's not a big deal, but things can go very bad, right? Canceled flights, canceled itineraries, right? Injury, illness. There's all sorts of things that are, these are not small problems, right? These are massive issues. I think it's very hard to bounce back from those. Trying your best not to harp on them is advice that I'm happy to give, but boy, is it shallow advice. I think it's hard, right? Again, I mentioned at the top of our conversation, I had this trip in Costa Rica not too long ago. And one of the things that happened, this is incidental to the trip itself, is our flight home was canceled. So we had to stay an extra night in Costa Rica. What I love about my kids in this regard is I'm stressing out, right? Because here, okay, now I have to find a hotel and I got to do all the things that have to happen when your flight gets canceled. There's no other flights out of the country at that point. We had to stay the night. And I'm stressing out. And my kids are just like, so we get to spend another day in the pool at the hotel. And so as simplistic as that is, I think that they're right. Like, they had the right attitude about it. They're like, okay, here's the negative. How do we make a positive out of this negative as best we can? Easier said than done. I don't want to simplify this and say that, yeah, oh, just ignore the bad thing. I still stress about the fact that we had to have that canceled flight and all the things that, the consequences that came from that. But we did have a really nice day. Like, we found a nice hotel and we had travel insurance, so it wasn't a big deal. Like, there was no extra cost to us other than the time. And we had nice meals and we had a nice time at the pool. And We all, huddled in a hotel room, and it was it was an adventure, right? More than anything else. So reframing as best you can to what's positive, if it's possible. And again, I don't want to sugarcoat it because there are times where it's just bad, right? Like you get injured, you get sick. It's hard, right? You can't recover from that so easily. Yeah.
I totally agree with you, though. In fact, I think about coming home from a friend's 50th birthday a couple years ago, and same thing, our flight got canceled. But I was like, okay, I've never been to Graceland. We're going to spend the night in Memphis. Stuff to see here. I don't think about that canceled flight anymore. I just think about how cool it was to go to Graceland.
Yeah. That's great. It's easy advice to give. It's hard advice to follow, though. So I get that.
I'd love to hear just a couple of emerging trends from you that you're seeing in consumer behavior that might relate to travel. You mentioned your work in sentimental value and gift giving, which I love. I'm sure you're seeing other things that are interesting.
As a researcher, I get to do a lot less of the like, here's the thing of the day. I study much more of the fundamental psychology of like why things happen, what happens, how do we apply that. And so I'm not as fluent at this. I feel like curation is happening more to what you're doing with your work. Curation of trips is becoming more popular, and that comes in lots of different forms. Like I've seen products that give you stories of the places that you're passing by based on the geolocation. So on your phone, they give you these, right? So as you're traveling, you can be more immersed with the local of what's going on. And so instead of just saying, here's a trip, go to this place, you're getting more of this guidance on how to experience that. And that's a mixed bag, right? Because if it works, that's wonderful. But your idea of an ideal trip might not be my idea of an ideal trip. So if there's that mismatch, then that's a problem. So I do think you're starting to see more of this. Again, it's going to come back to expectations like we've been talking about. If I think your curation is going to be fantastic and then it's not for whatever reason, that's a bad experience as compared to if I just went into a cold and did whatever it was I did. Now, the flip is true as well. If you curate something for me and it's amazing, well, then you've more than exceeded my expectations. So I think we are probably seeing a little bit more of that.
Having done a lot of research on consumer behavior and really with the eye towards maintaining happiness, if you had to sum up some of the tips that you would give based on what you've learned about psychology, what really general advice would you give to people?
So two different pieces of advice. One is directly from my research, one is not, but it's adjacent to it. We talked about this a little bit already. Variety, it's so important. I mean, the adage variety is the spice of life is there for a reason. And it's so unbelievably true. We've all intuitively got this, right? When your bored days are, you know what causes those, sitting around doing nothing. But introducing something new and different and doing that intentionally is an incredibly effective way to keep yourself happy and keep the things that you love still enjoyable as opposed to overdoing those. So I think that is a no-brainer. Adjacent to that is what are the big factors in life that actually lead to happiness. So people think it's money. It's not money. It's helpful, and having little money is hard, but having a lot of money is not amazing, and not as amazing as people think. It's social connections. So being intentional with your social connections, with your family, with your friends, is arguably the single most important input to well-being and life satisfaction and happiness. And to tie it back to travel, some of my fondest travel experiences are the ones that I did with my friends, right? I have traveled alone before, and that's been fun, but boy, is it not as fun as when I go with people that I like and enjoy and meet new people that I then wind up liking. And I think that ties into the psychology of social connection is the thing that makes us humans. And it's the thing that makes us super happy. So if you can marry that with your travels, I think that's a win.
I couldn't agree more. I'm so lucky that I get to do that a fair amount for work and for play. And it's funny that you say that because I mentioned I was just chimp trekking. And one of the neat things about watching those creatures is you just realize we are social animals just as they are. That's in our DNA.
Very much so.
This has been super interesting. Thank you so much. Last question I have for you is where do you want to go most?
So I have an answer for you. So it's there's a short answer. I'll give you the slightly longer one. Before we had our kids, my wife and I sat down and very thoughtfully said, what's our like baby moon or whatever people call it these days is going to be? Like, what's the place we want to go to? And it was down to two options. Option one was a safari in Africa, and option two was cruise to Antarctica. And believe it or not, we chose Antarctica, and it was still one of the greatest trips of my life. But we chose it because we were afraid that by the time our kids were old enough to join us, it would be so fundamentally different from climate change that it would just be a different place. And so glad we did it. Hoping to do it again. It was still one of the best things I've done. But safari in Africa is the next bucket list item.
Amazing. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Special thanks to Jeff for joining me today to explore the science behind designing a great vacation. I started Indigare to inspire and empower people to change their lives and the world through travel. And many of the principles that drive our content and curation are directly related to Jeff's science, as is our new trip planning tool. We will certainly bear all of his findings in mind as we continue to plan trips for our members and in our quest for creating the best possible travel experiences. Coming up on Passport to Everywhere, I'll be going behind the scenes at the legendary hotel Cap Roca on Mallorca. Be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter at indigare.com for the latest travel news and insider intel. And if you're an Indigare member, reach out to your trip designer to start planning your optimal dream vacation, or sign on to the website to check out our brand new trip planning tool. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us at Passport to Everywhere. We hope you'll join the journey and subscribe. For more travel inspiration, visit indigare.com. INDAGARE. This has been Passport to Everywhere.